It was supposed to be just another quiet night. I'd always been a light sleeper, prone to waking up at odd hours, but sleep paralysis? That was something I had never experienced before, at least not until that night. That night changed everything. I had gone to bed early, feeling more exhausted than usual. The weight of the day had worn me down, and I was looking forward to a long, uninterrupted sleep. My apartment was quiet, my phone on silent, and the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Everything seemed peaceful. It started with a dream, or at least I thought it was a dream. I was lying in bed just as I had been before falling asleep, but the room seemed different somehow, darker, more oppressive. I could feel a presence in the room with me, though I couldn't see it. It was as if the air had thickened, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My arms, my legs, they were completely unresponsive, as if they had been glued to the bed. Panic set in. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat was constricted, my vocal cords paralyzed. I was trapped in my own body, completely helpless. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow in the corner of the room, barely visible in the darkness. But as I stared, unable to tear my eyes away, it began to take shape. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch out unnaturally. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was a black void, featureless and terrifying. But I could feel its eyes on me, watching, waiting. I tried to convince myself that it was just a dream, that I would wake up any moment and everything would be fine. But the longer I lay there, the more real it felt. The weight on my chest grew heavier, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. I could feel the bed sinking beneath me, as if something was crawling up from underneath, ready to drag me down into the abyss. The shadow moved closer, its limbs creaking as it slowly approached the side of my bed. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything to get away from it, but I was completely paralyzed. All I could do was watch as it loomed over me, its faceless head hovering inches from mine. Then it reached out. Its hand, if you could call it that, was cold, icy cold, as it brushed against my skin. The touch sent a wave of terror through me, unlike anything I had ever felt before. It wasn't just fear, it was pure, primal horror, the kind that makes your blood run cold and your heart stop. The creature leaned closer, its presence suffocating, and I could feel its breath on my face, though there was no mouth, no lips to blow air. It whispered something, a low, guttural sound that I couldn't understand, but the meaning was clear. It wanted me. It was going to take me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the weight on my chest lifted. I gasped, my body jolting as I finally regained control of my limbs. I shot up in bed, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart racing. The room was silent again, the shadow gone, as if it had never been there, but I knew it had. I sat there in the dark, my body trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been a nightmare? Sleep paralysis? Or was it something more? I had heard of people experiencing strange things during sleep paralysis, seeing figures, feeling trapped. But this felt different. It felt real. For the next few days, I tried to push the experience out of my mind. I told myself it was just a fluke, a one-time thing. But deep down, I knew better. There was something in my apartment, something that had come for me that night. And it wasn't done with me yet. The next incident happened a week later. This time, I had been in a deep sleep when I woke up abruptly, my body frozen once again. I could feel the familiar pressure on my chest, the weight pinning me down. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the shadow, but everything seemed normal. The moonlight filtered in through the curtains, casting soft shadows on the walls. But the air felt wrong. Heavy, charged with something dark. And then I heard it, a soft whisper, barely audible, coming from the corner of the room. It was the same voice, the same guttural sound that had haunted me before. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to hear the words, but they were too distorted, too alien to comprehend. Slowly my eyes were drawn to the corner where the voice was coming from. And there it was again, the shadow, taller and more menacing than before. It was crouched in the corner, its long arms resting on the floor, its head tilted at an unnatural angle as it stared at me. My breath hitched in my throat as the shadow began to move, crawling toward me with slow, deliberate movements. Its limbs creaked with each step, the sound sending chills down my spine. I wanted to scream, to thrash, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, just like before. The creature reached the side of my bed and stopped, towering over me. I could feel its cold breath on my face again, the icy chills seeping into my skin. It reached out, its hand hovering inches from my chest, and I braced myself for the touch. But this time, it didn't touch me. Instead, it spoke. "You're mine." The words were clear, sharp, cutting through the air like a knife. My heart skipped a beat, my body trembling with fear. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for sure: it wasn't going to leave me alone. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The weight on my chest lifted and I shot up in bed, gasping for air. My body was drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my mind spinning. I glanced around the room, but everything seemed normal again. No shadow, no whispers, but I knew it wasn't over. The incidents continued, each one more terrifying than the last. Every time I fell asleep, I would wake up in the middle of the night, paralyzed, with that same shadowy figure looming over me. It spoke to me, taunted me, claimed me as its own. And no matter what I did, I couldn't escape it. I tried everything: sleeping pills, meditation, even sleeping with the lights on. But nothing worked. The shadow always found me, always crept back into my room when I was at my most vulnerable. I became terrified of sleep, dreading the moment when I would have to close my eyes and surrender to the darkness. I stopped going out, stopped seeing friends, stopped living. My life became a constant battle with the shadow, a fight for control over my own mind and body. And then, one night, it escalated. I had been lying in bed for hours, too afraid to sleep, when I felt it. The familiar weight on my chest, the paralysis setting in. My heart raced as I tried to move, but my body was unresponsive, locked in place. The shadow was there again, standing at the foot of my bed, its dark form blending into the night. But this time, it didn't crawl toward me. It didn't speak. It just stood there, watching, waiting. And then, without warning, it lunged at me. I gasped, my body jolting awake as the shadow disappeared. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. But something was different this time. The fear was still there, but there was something else. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, a presence in the room with me, watching me from the darkness. It wasn't the shadow, it was something else, something darker. I sat up in bed, my eyes scanning the room, but I couldn't see anything. The air felt thick, heavy with an unseen force. My skin prickled, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. And then I heard it. A soft, barely audible whisper. "You're
Mine." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice wasn't coming from the corner this time. It was coming from right beside me. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, and there it was. The shadow, standing right next to my bed, its cold, lifeless eyes staring into mine. And this time, I couldn't wake up.
Sleep had never been a problem for me, at least not until that one night when everything changed. Before then, I'd always been able to drift off with ease, sinking into the comfort of my bed and letting the world fade away. But now, even the thought of sleep fills me with dread, because I know what waits for me on the other side. It all started a few months ago. I had just moved into a new apartment, a cozy little place on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, the neighbors were quiet, and it seemed like the perfect spot for someone like me who craved solitude after long work days. I thought it would be my peaceful retreat from the chaos of life. But what I didn't know was that something else lived there. Something that would make me question the boundary between dreams and reality. The first few nights in the apartment were uneventful. I slept soundly, waking up refreshed and ready to tackle the day. But then, one night I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. I couldn't tell what had disturbed my sleep, but I felt strange. There was a heaviness in the air, a stillness that was unnatural. It was as if the entire world had frozen in time, leaving me trapped in that moment. I tried to move, but I couldn't. My arms, my legs, they were completely unresponsive.
As if they had been weighed down by invisible chains. Panic surged through me as I realized I was paralyzed. I had heard of sleep paralysis before, but I'd never experienced it myself. It was terrifying. My mind raced as I struggled to break
free, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't move a muscle. Then the shadows in the room began to shift. At first, I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. After all, I had just woken up, and it was still dark outside. But as I watched, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, twisting and contorting into unnatural shapes. One of them, in particular, caught my attention. It was darker than the others, its form more solid, more menacing. It hovered in the corner of the room, watching me. I tried to scream, but no sound came.
Out.
My throat was constricted, my vocal cords paralyzed. I was completely helpless, trapped in my own body, with that thing watching me. It was tall, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch out in unnatural angles. Its face, if you could even call it that, was a black void, featureless and terrifying. But I could feel its gaze on me, as if it was studying me, waiting for something. The room grew colder as the shadow moved closer, its long limbs dragging along the floor with a sound that sent chills down my spine. I could hear it breathing, though I couldn't see any mouth or nose. The sound was low, guttural, like the growl of an animal. My heart raced, my pulse pounding in my ears as the creature loomed over me. Then it spoke. The voice was deep, otherworldly, and it sent a wave of terror through me. "You don't belong here," it whispered, the words echoing in the silence of the room. "This is my realm." I tried to respond, but my mouth wouldn't move. The fear was overwhelming, consuming me from the inside out. I could feel the weight of the creature's presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. It was as if the very air around me had turned to stone, trapping me in place. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The paralysis lifted, and I gasped for air, my body jerking as I finally regained control. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, my body drenched in sweat. The room was silent again, the shadows back to their normal, harmless state. But I knew what I had seen. I knew it wasn't just a dream. For the next few nights, I avoided sleep as much as I could. I stayed up late, watching TV or scrolling through my phone, anything to keep myself awake. But eventually, exhaustion caught up with me, and I had no choice but to close my eyes and surrender to sleep. That's when the real nightmare began. I woke up again in the middle of the night, unable to move, just like before. The room was cold, colder than it had been the first time, and I could feel the presence of something watching me. The shadow was back, hovering in the corner of the room, but this time it wasn't alone. There were others with it, smaller figures that seemed to move in unison, their forms flickering in and out of existence like they were caught between two worlds. I could hear them whispering to each other, their voices low and unintelligible, but I knew they were talking about me. I could feel their eyes on me, their presence suffocating. The main shadow moved closer again, its long limbs stretching out toward me. "You don't belong here," it whispered again, its voice more
menacing this time. "This is our realm."
I tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything to break free, but my body refused to respond. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of whatever these things were. The shadow reached out, its hand, or what I assumed was its hand, brushing
against my chest. The touch was icy cold, like death itself, and it sent a shockwave of terror through me. "You'll never escape," it whispered, its voice echoing in my mind.
And then, just like before, it was over. The paralysis lifted and I shot up in bed, gasping for air. But this time the fear didn't fade. It lingered like a dark cloud hanging over me. I knew that whatever was happening wasn't just in my
mind. It was real, and it wasn't going to stop. The nights that followed were a blur of terror and exhaustion.
Every time I closed my eyes, the shadows would return, watching me, taunting me, claiming me as their own. I couldn't escape them, no matter how hard I tried. They were always there, waiting for me in the darkness. I became obsessed with finding
answers. I scoured the internet for information about sleep paralysis, reading countless articles and stories from people who had experienced similar things. But nothing I found made sense. The shadows, the voices, they didn't fit the typical
descriptions of sleep paralysis. This was something else, something far darker. One night, in a desperate attempt to make sense of it all, I decided to confront the shadows head on. I stayed up late, waiting for the paralysis to set in, hoping that if I faced them, maybe they would leave me alone. I lay in bed, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for the inevitable. And then it happened. The familiar weight settled on my chest, and I was paralyzed once again. The room grew cold, and the shadows appeared, their forms flickering, in the corners of my vision. But this time I wasn't afraid. I was determined to confront them, to demand answers. The main shadow moved closer, its dark form towering over me. "You don't belong here," it whispered, just like before. But this time, I fought back. In my mind, I screamed at the shadow, demanding to know what it wanted from me, why it was tormenting me. For a moment, the shadow hesitated. Its form flickered, as if it was taken aback by my defiance. But then it leaned closer, its cold breath washing over me. "You are trapped," it whispered, its voice filled with malice. "Trapped between worlds, and you will never escape." With those words, the shadow vanished and the paralysis lifted. I sat up in bed, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion, but I knew that the shadow was right. I was trapped, caught between the world of the living and the realm of the shadows. And, no matter what I did, I couldn't escape. The shadows still come for me every night, watching, waiting. I've tried everything to break free, medication, therapy, even moving to a new place. But it doesn't matter. The shadows always
Find me, because I don't belong in this world anymore. I belong to them.
Sleep has always been my refuge, my escape from the stress of daily life. The world can be cruel and chaotic, but in my dreams I could always find peace. That was until one night changed everything. Sleep was no longer my sanctuary, it had become my prison. It began innocuously enough. I had been working long hours at the office, my days filled with meetings and deadlines. Exhaustion clung to me like a second skin. When I finally got home, all I could think about was collapsing into bed and drifting off into a deep, uninterrupted sleep. I lived alone in a small apartment. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was comfortable enough for someone like me who wasn't home much anyway. It was the kind of place where the noise from outside would usually lull me to sleep, the occasional car passing by or the faint murmur of people walking on the street, the kind of white noise that always helped me settle into the darkness of sleep. That night, however, was different. I remember lying down, pulling the blankets over myself, and closing my eyes. But instead of the sweet relief of sleep, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. It was subtle at first, a small prickle at the back of my mind that grew stronger with each passing moment. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the result of stress or too much caffeine. But as the minutes dragged on, the feeling only intensified. My body felt heavy, like I was sinking deeper into the mattress. I tried to move, to shift positions, but I couldn't. It was as though my limbs had turned to stone. Panic began to bubble up inside me as I realized I couldn't move at all. My arms, my legs, even my fingers were completely paralyzed. I was wide awake but trapped in my own body. The darkness in my room seemed to press down on me, and my breath caught in my throat as I sensed something in the room with me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. A presence, cold and oppressive, like a shadow that had taken on a life of its own. It was watching me. I lay there, frozen, my heart pounding in my chest as the air grew thick with dread. My eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the presence. At first, everything looked normal. The faint outline of the furniture, the dim glow of the streetlight filtering through the curtains. But then I saw it. In the far corner of the room, just beyond the reach of the light, a shadow darker than the rest shifted. My pulse quickened as I realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more, something alive. The figure was tall, its shape unnaturally slender and twisted, like it had been stretched beyond the limits of a human body. Its head was cocked to the side, and though I couldn't see its face, I knew it was staring directly at me. I wanted to scream, to thrash against the invisible bonds that held me down, but my body refused to obey. As I lay there, trapped in my own body, the figure began to move. Slowly, deliberately, it stepped closer to the bed. Its movements were unnatural, jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. With each step, the temperature in the room seemed to drop, and a cold sweat broke out across my skin. The closer it got, the more intense the feeling of dread became. I could hear its footsteps now, soft but deliberate, as it crept toward me. My heart raced, and my breaths came in shallow gasps as the figure stopped at the foot of my bed. It stood there for what felt like an eternity, just watching me. I could feel its gaze, heavy and oppressive, like it was weighing my very soul. Then, without warning, it moved. In one fluid motion, the figure lunged forward, its face inches from mine. My entire body tensed as a wave of pure terror washed over me. I still couldn't make out its features. Its face was a swirling mass
of darkness, void of any recognizable shape. But I could feel its breath on my skin, cold and unnatural, like the air from an open grave.
It didn't speak, but I heard its voice in my mind, a low, guttural whisper that echoed through my thoughts. "You can't escape." My heart hammered in my chest as the figure loomed over me, its shadowy form enveloping me like a suffocating
shroud. I was drowning in fear, my mind spiraling into panic as the figure reached out, its hand hovering just above my chest. I could feel the cold radiating from it, like death itself.
And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The paralysis lifted, and I shot up in bed, gasping for air. My body was drenched in sweat, my heart still pounding in my chest. I looked around the room, expecting to see the figure, standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. The room was empty. For a moment I sat there in disbelief, trying to convince myself it had all been a dream. But it hadn't felt like a dream. It had felt real, too real. My body still tingled with the cold from the figure's touch, and the sense of dread lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to go about my usual routine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak in the floorboards sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew the truth. Whatever had visited me that night wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was real. The nights that followed were even worse. Each time I went to bed, the paralysis would return. I would wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move, with the same oppressive presence looming over me. The figure would always be there, standing in the corner of the room, watching me with its featureless face. Sometimes it would speak, its voice slithering into my mind like a poisonous fog. "You belong to me," it would say. "You can't escape." I tried everything to stop the episodes. I researched sleep paralysis, read about other people's experiences, and even tried some of the techniques I found online to prevent it. But nothing worked. The figure kept coming back, night after night, and each time it seemed to grow stronger, more menacing. One night, after weeks of sleeplessness and terror, I finally reached my breaking point. I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to confront the figure, to demand answers. When the paralysis came that night, I was ready. I lay there, my body frozen as the figure appeared in the corner of the room. It moved toward me, just as it had every other night, but this time I didn't let the fear consume me. I focused all my energy on one thought. I wasn't going to let it win. The figure stopped at the foot of my bed, its cold presence wrapping around me like a vice. "You can't escape," it whispered. But this time I whispered back, "What do you want from me?" For a moment, the figure hesitated. Its form flickered, like it was struggling to maintain its shape. Then it spoke again, its voice colder than ever. "You are mine." I forced my body to move, summoning every ounce of strength I had. Slowly, painfully, I managed to lift my arm. My hand trembled as I reached out toward the figure, and as my fingers brushed against its shadowy form, I felt a surge of cold, so intense it burned. But I didn't stop. With a final burst of strength, I grabbed hold of the figure, my hand, closing around its arm. The cold was unbearable, but I held on, refusing to let go. The figure let out a sound, not a scream, but something far worse. It was a low, guttural wail that echoed through my mind, filling me with a sense of dread so intense it threatened to consume me. And then, just like that, it was gone. The paralysis lifted, and I collapsed back onto the bed, gasping for air.
My body was weak, my mind exhausted, but I had done it. I had fought back. That was the last time I saw the figure. It hasn't returned since that night, and for the first time in weeks, I've been able to sleep without fear.
But I know it's not gone. Not really. It's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to return. And when it does, I'll be ready. Because now I know the truth. I don't belong to it. But it's only a matter of time before it tries to take me back. I've always been a deep sleeper. My friends and family joke that a thunderstorm couldn't wake me, that I'd sleep through an earthquake if one ever happened. But after the night of my 28th birthday, I can no longer find solace in sleep. What happened that night changed me in ways I still can't fully comprehend. Sleep became a doorway to something else, something dark and horrifying. It started after a long day of celebrations. My close friends had gathered at a bar to celebrate my birthday, and as the night went on, we drank and laughed, sharing stories and toasts. By the time I returned to my small apartment, I was feeling pleasantly tipsy and ready for bed. My apartment was a cozy one, bedroom in an older part of the city. The creaky floors and slightly outdated fixtures never bothered me. It was home, and I liked the peace it offered. That night, I felt exhausted but happy as I changed into my pajamas and fell into bed. Sleep came quickly, as it usually did, and I sank into the familiar warmth of unconsciousness. But then something happened, something I can't fully explain. I woke up in the middle of the night, or at least I thought I was awake. My eyes opened, and the room looked the same as it always did. The faint light from the street lamps outside filtered through the blinds, casting dim lines across the floor. But something was wrong. I couldn't move. My arms, legs, even my fingers, they were frozen in place. Panic surged through me as I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't respond. My breathing quickened, and my heart pounded in my chest. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was like being trapped inside my own body. The familiar sensation of sleep paralysis was something I had heard about before. Friends had shared their experiences with it, those terrifying moments of being awake but unable to move, of feeling trapped inside your own body. I had always thought it sounded scary, but I never imagined how truly horrific it could be until it happened to me. But this was different. This wasn't just a case of my body refusing to move. There was something in the room with me. At first, it was just a feeling, a sense that I wasn't alone. The air in the room felt heavier, colder, as though something had sucked all the warmth out. My eyes darted around the room, but everything looked the same. The dresser, the bedside table, the door to the hallway, it was all where it should be. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow moved. At first, I thought it was my imagination, just a trick of the light or a result of my panic. But as I stared at the corner of the room, I realized it wasn't a shadow. It was something else, something darker, something alive. The figure was standing at the foot of my bed, its form barely visible in the dim light. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and thin, like the twisted branches of a tree. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was nothing more than
a void, a black emptiness that seemed to swallow the light around it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to thrash against the paralysis that held me captive.
but I couldn't. My heart raced as the figure moved closer, its movements slow and deliberate, like it knew it had all the time in the world. The figure stopped at the side of my bed, its presence so close I could feel the cold radiating off
Of it. My breath came in short, shallow gasps, my chest heaving with the effort of trying to move. But no matter how hard I fought, my body refused to obey. Then, without warning, the figure bent down, its faceless void inches from mine. I could
feel the weight of its gaze, though it had no eyes. It was like it was staring into my soul, reading every fear, every doubt, every weakness I had ever known. It didn't speak, but I heard its voice in my mind, a low, guttural whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "You're not alone." My heart pounded so loudly, I was sure it would burst from my chest. I tried to scream, to thrash, to do anything, to get away from this thing, but I was trapped in my own body, unable to move, unable to escape. The figure stayed there, its presence oppressive and suffocating for what felt like hours. Time seemed to stretch on, each second dragging into eternity. I don't know how long it lasted, but eventually the figure straightened and stepped back. I felt a small flicker of relief, hoping that maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then the figure reached out. Its long, bony hand hovered over my chest, and I could feel the cold radiating from it, like ice seeping into my bones. The figure's touch was light, almost delicate, but the moment its fingers brushed against my skin, a wave of terror crashed over me. It was like being submerged in ice, cold water, my body frozen in fear, my mind screaming for escape. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The figure vanished, disappearing into the darkness as if it had never been there at all. The paralysis lifted, and I bolted upright in bed, gasping for air. My body trembled, drenched in sweat, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. For a few moments I just sat there, staring at the empty room, trying to convince myself it had all been a dream. But I knew better. It hadn't felt like a dream. It had felt real, too real. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went about my day in a haze, my mind still reeling from the night's events. I tried to convince myself it was just sleep paralysis, that it had all been in my head, but deep down, I knew the truth. That figure, whatever it was,
had been real, and it wasn't done with me.
Over the next few nights, the episodes became more frequent. Each time I would wake up, paralyzed, with the same oppressive feeling of being watched. The figure would always be there, standing at the foot of my bed, watching me with its empty, faceless gaze. Sometimes it would speak, its voice a whisper in my mind, telling me things I didn't want to hear. "You're not alone. I'm always here. You can't escape." I tried everything to stop the episodes: meditation, sleep aids, even rearranging my room to change the energy, but nothing worked. The figure kept coming back, night after night, and with each visit, it grew stronger. The paralysis lasted longer, the figure's presence more menacing. I began to dread going to sleep, knowing that I would wake up in the middle of the night, trapped in my own body with that thing watching me. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights and mounting terror, I decided to confront the figure. I didn't know what else to do. I was desperate. So when the paralysis came that night and the figure appeared at the foot of my bed, I gathered every ounce of strength I had and spoke. "What do you want from me?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silent and still, its faceless void staring at me. For a moment, I thought it wouldn't respond. But then I heard its voice, louder this time, more insistent. "You belong to me." Fear surged through me, but I didn't back down. "Why? Why are you doing this to me?" The figure leaned closer, its cold breath chilling my skin. "Because you called me." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had never called for anything, never invited this thing into my life. But as I lay there, trapped in my own body, I remembered something from my past that I had long since buried. When I was a child, I had been fascinated by the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, demons. I had devoured books and stories about them, desperate to know more. One night, when I was about 10 years old, I had found an old book in my grandmother's attic. It was filled with strange symbols and rituals, and in my childish curiosity, I had tried one of them. It was a simple ritual, or so I had thought at the time. Light a candle, say a few words, and call for a spirit to reveal itself. I had done it in my room, late at night, hoping to see a ghost. Nothing had happened, and I had laughed it off, thinking it was just a silly game. But now, as I lay there, the figure's words echoing in my mind, I realized that it hadn't been a game at all. I had called for something that night, and it had finally come. "You belong to me," the figure repeated, its voice a low growl. I wanted to scream, to deny it, but I couldn't. The truth was there, staring me in the face. I had brought this upon myself. The figure leaned even closer, its cold breath chilling my skin. "You called me, and now you can't escape." And just like that, the paralysis lifted. The figure vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness, my body trembling with fear. I haven't slept since that night. Every time I close my eyes, I feel the figure's presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for me to slip into sleep so it can I had always been a rational person. I never put much stock into the supernatural or the unexplainable. It was easier to believe that everything had a logical reason, a scientific explanation that could soothe the mind. That all changed in the span of a single night, a night that has haunted me ever since. It all began when I moved into a new apartment on the outskirts of town. The rent was cheap, the location quiet, and the place had a certain charm to it, with its high ceiling and large windows overlooking a small forest. I was thrilled to finally have a place of my own, somewhere I could unwind and escape the pressures of my daily life. But things began to change the first night I slept there. I remember feeling unusually exhausted that day. I had spent hours unpacking and arranging furniture, so by the time night fell, I was ready to crash. I didn't even bother setting up my bed properly, just threw some sheets on the mattress and collapsed. The cool night air drifted through the slightly open window, and soon I was fast asleep. At least, I thought I was. Somewhere in the deep recesses of sleep, I felt it, a presence. It wasn't something I saw, not at first, but rather something I felt in my bones, an oppressive weight that settled over me, making the air around me thick and heavy. It was like my body was submerged in some invisible substance, unable to move or react. I could hear the soft hum of the city far off in the distance, the occasional car driving by, the rustle of leaves outside my window. But beneath all of that was something else, something unnatural. I tried to open my eyes, but they wouldn't budge. It was as though they had been glued shut, despite feeling like I was wide awake. My mind raced, panic setting in as I attempted to move any part
of my body, an arm, a leg, even just a finger.
But nothing. I was trapped, frozen in place, unable to make a sound. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was my mind playing tricks on me, but then I felt it, something cold and unearthly, standing by the side
of my bed. I couldn't see it, but I could sense it. The air around me grew colder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Whatever it was watching me. I strained against the invisible force holding me down, desperate to move, to break free from the paralysis that had taken over my body. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I wanted to scream, to call out for help, but my lips remained sealed, as if they too were under some dark spell. Then in the pitch, black darkness behind my closed eyes, I saw it. It was a figure, shadowy and indistinct, but undeniably real. It stood at the foot of my bed, its form twisting and undulating like smoke. It didn't have a face, just a dark, swirling void where its features should have been. But I knew it was watching me, observing my every futile attempt to break free. I tried to rationalize what was happening, to convince myself that it was just a dream, that this thing wasn't real. But no matter how hard I tried to wake myself up, I couldn't. The paralysis held me fast, and the figure moved closer.
It didn't walk. It floated, gliding silently through the air until it was hovering right above me. I could feel its cold presence pressing down on me, suffocating me, making it harder to breathe. My chest tightened, my breaths coming in short.
Ragged gasps as I struggled to draw in air. It was as though the figure was draining the very life out of me, feeding off my fear. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it spoke. Its voice was like a whisper, barely audible but still chilling.
To the core. "You're mine now," it said, the words sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to scream again, but nothing came out. My throat was dry, my mouth clamped shut, as though it had been sewn together. My mind raced, searching for any possible way to break free from this nightmare, but the harder I fought, the stronger the figure's presence became. It leaned in closer, its void, like face hovering inches from mine. I could feel its cold breath against my skin, a sensation that made my entire body shiver. "You can't escape," it whispered again, its voice more insistent this time. I don't know how long it lasted, minutes, hours. It all blurred together in my panic. But eventually the figure began to retreat. It floated back to the foot of my bed, still watching me with that faceless void, before disappearing into the darkness. The moment it was gone, the paralysis lifted. My body jolted upright, drenched in sweat, my heart racing as I gasped for
air. I looked around the room, my eyes wide with terror, but everything was still.
The room was exactly as it had been before I fell asleep, quiet, peaceful, with the soft rustle of leaves outside the window. But I knew better. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still feel that thing's presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my consciousness, waiting for the right moment to strike again. The next few nights were the same. Every time I tried to sleep, the paralysis would take hold, and the figure would return. It became a twisted ritual, this nightly battle between me and the shadowy entity that haunted my dreams. I tried everything to stop it, sleeping with the lights on, moving my bed to a different part of the room, even staying up for as long as I could. But nothing worked. The figure kept coming back, stronger and more insistent each time. I began to dread going to
bed, knowing that as soon as I closed my eyes, I would be trapped in that nightmare once again.
My once peaceful apartment had become a prison, and I had no idea how to escape. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights and mounting terror, I decided to try something different. I didn't know if it would work, but I was desperate for
answers, for some way to rid myself of this torment. I had heard about lucid dreaming before, the idea that you could control your dreams if you became aware that you were dreaming.
I figured it was worth a shot. That night, I went to bed with a new determination. I focused on staying aware, on recognizing when the paralysis took hold, and when it did, when I felt that familiar weight settle over me and the figure appeared. At the foot of my bed, I knew what I had to do. I fought against the paralysis, not with fear, but with control. I focused all my energy on moving, on breaking free from the invisible chains that held me down. It was like swimming through molasses, each movement slow and difficult, but eventually I was able to move my arm. Just a little, but enough to feel a spark of hope. The figure noticed. It moved closer, its void, like face, hovering over mine once again. "You can't escape," it hissed, its voice filled with anger. But I didn't stop. I kept pushing, kept fighting, until finally I was able to move my entire body. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest as I stared down the shadowy figure. "You're not real," I said, my voice shaking but firm. "You're just a nightmare." The figure paused, its form flickering as though it were unsure of itself. For a moment, I thought I had won, that I had somehow broken the spell. But then it spoke again, its voice darker and more menacing than ever. "I am real," it said, "and you belong to me." With those words, the figure lunged at me, its cold, shadowy form wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I screamed, thrashing against it, but it was too strong. It pulled me down, down into the darkness, and for a moment I thought I was lost. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I woke up in my bed, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was still, the early morning light filtering through the window. The figure was gone, but the fear remained. I don't know if I truly defeated the figure that night, or if it's still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. But I haven't experienced sleep paralysis since that night. Maybe I broke free. Or maybe it's just biding its time, waiting for me to let my guard down. I don't think I'll ever sleep peacefully again. Sleep peacefully. The halls of Crestview High were always bustling during the day, filled with students chatting about everything from homework to the latest trends. But at night, it was an entirely different place. It transformed into something eerie, unsettling, and worst of all, haunted. At least that's what the rumors said. I never believed them, of course. I mean, who really believes in haunted schools? Ghost stories were just things kids made up to pass the time or scare each other. At least that's what I thought until I had to stay late one night for a group project. It was the beginning of October, and the days were growing shorter. The chill of autumn had settled in, and the leaves outside were turning shades of gold and crimson. My friends, Sarah and Jason and I, were working on a history project that was due at the end of the week. We figured we'd stay after school to finish it up, but time got away from us. By the time we realized how late it was, the sun had already set. We were in the library, a room that seemed far less inviting at night. The long wooden tables, normally filled with students studying or goofing off, were empty, and the towering bookshelves cast long, dark shadows. The overhead lights flickered now and then, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. "Okay, I think that's enough for tonight," Jason said, yawning as he stretched his arms over his head. "I'm getting tired." Sarah nodded, gathering her notes. "Yeah, we should head out. I don't want to be here when the janitor locks up." I packed up my things, but just as we were about to leave, a loud thump echoed through the hallway outside the library. We all froze. "What was that?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaky. "I'm sure it's nothing," Jason said, though his tone didn't sound as confident as his words. "Maybe just the wind or something." The three of us glanced at each other, and despite every instinct telling me to ignore it and go home, something in me felt drawn to the noise. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just the thrill of doing something stupid. But before I knew it, I was walking toward the door. "Wait!" Sarah hissed, grabbing my arm. "What are you doing?" "I just want to check it out," I said, shrugging her off. "It's probably nothing." Jason sighed. "If you're going, we're all going. We don't need you disappearing into some creepy hallway by yourself." With that, we stepped out into the empty corridor, the sound of our footsteps echoing off the walls. The school looked entirely different at night. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, and the lockers, which seemed so ordinary during the day, looked like ominous sentinels in the dim light. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was irrational, but it gnawed at me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I tried to push the thought aside and focus on finding the source of the noise. The hall was completely silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights overhead and the soft squeak of our shoes against the tile floor. We passed by classroom after classroom, each one dark and empty, their doors slightly ajar. And then we heard it again. Thump. It was louder this time, coming from somewhere near the old gym. We turned the corner, and that's when we saw it. The door to the gym was cracked open just slightly, but enough for us to see inside. There was something moving in the darkness, a shadow that seemed to flicker and shift as though it were alive.
"Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Yeah," Jason muttered, his eyes wide. "What the hell is that?" I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. "Let's check it out." Jason grabbed my arm. "Are you crazy? We should get out of here." But it was too late.
I had already stepped forward, pushing the gym door open a little further. The room beyond was almost pitch black, save for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the high windows. At first, I didn't see anything. The gym looked just as it always had, rows of bleachers along the walls, the basketball court stretching out before us. But then something moved in the shadows. A figure, tall and gaunt, stood at the far end of the gym. It was facing away from us, its back turned, as it stared at the wall. Its head hung low, and its long, thin arms dangled at its sides. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. I don't know, I whispered back, my voice shaking. But we need to leave, now. We turned to run, but as we did, the gym door slammed shut behind us with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the room, and the figure at the end of the gym began to move. Slowly at first, but then faster, its footsteps heavy as it sprinted toward us. Panic surged through me, and I bolted for the door. I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, trapping us inside with whatever that thing was. "Help me!" I shouted, yanking at the door as hard as I could. Jason and Sarah rushed to my side, pulling on the handle with me, but it was no use. The door wouldn't open. Behind us, the figure was getting closer, its footsteps pounding against the floor. We were out of time. With no other options, we ran. We darted toward the bleachers, hoping to hide, but as we scrambled up the steps, the figure's footsteps stopped. I turned around, my heart pounding in my chest, expecting to see it standing right behind us, but the gym was empty. The figure was gone. "What the hell?" Jason gasped, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. "Where did it go?" "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. "But we need to get out of here." We waited, for what felt like hours, huddled together on the bleachers, too afraid to move. Eventually, the gym door creaked open on its own, the faint glow of the hallway light spilling into the room. We didn't waste any time. We bolted for the exit, not daring to look back. By the time we reached the front of the school, the parking lot was empty. The night was still, and the cold autumn air bit at our skin. We didn't speak as we climbed into Jason's car and sped away from Crestview High, but the silence between us was heavy with fear. None of us ever talked about that night again. We pretended it never happened, went on with our lives as if everything was normal. But I could never shake the feeling that we weren't alone in that gym. That whatever was in there with us was still watching, waiting. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear those footsteps, slow and
heavy, echoing through the dark hallways of Crestview High. But I'll never go back to find out.
The pep rallies at Westbrook High were legendary. Every fall, the football team would march into the gym, the crowd would go wild, and the cheerleaders would perform stunts that left everyone on their feet. It was a tradition, something that every student looked forward to, but after what happened last year, everything changed. I remember that day like it was yesterday, though I wish I could forget it. My best friend, Lily, was one of the most popular girls in school. She was the captain of the cheerleading squad, smart, funny, and beautiful. Everyone adored her, and she had a way of lighting up any room she walked into. That day was no different. The pep rally was set for a Friday afternoon in late October. The leaves had turned shades of red and gold, and the crisp autumn air was beginning to creep into the school. Everyone was excited, students, teachers, the football team, everyone. But there was something different about that day. Something
I couldn't quite put my finger on.
I remember feeling a strange sense of unease, like a storm was brewing, even though the sky outside was clear. We all filed into the gym, just like we always did. The bleachers were packed, the band was playing, and the cheerleaders were warming up on the floor. The gym was buzzing with energy, but that weird feeling stayed with me, gnawing at the back of my mind. Lily was at the center of it all as usual. She was leading the squad, her long blonde hair pulled back into a high ponytail, her blue and white cheer uniform perfectly pressed. She flashed me a smile from across the gym, and I waved back, trying to shake off the strange feeling that something was wrong. The rally began as it always did, with the principal giving a speech about school spirit, followed by a performance from the marching band. The football team took the stage next, the crowd roaring as they walked onto the gym floor. And then it was the cheerleaders' turn. I watched as Lily led her team through their routine, flipping and tumbling across the floor like she was weightless. She made everything look so easy, like she was born to be in the spotlight. But then, halfway through their performance, something happened. It was subtle at first. A flicker of the lights overhead, like the power was about to go out. No one else seemed to notice, but I did. I looked around, expecting to see the teachers or the principal react, but everyone's attention was on the cheerleaders. Then the lights flickered again, longer this time, casting strange shadows across the gym. A murmur went through the crowd, and the cheerleaders hesitated for a moment before continuing their routine. But that feeling of unease I'd had all day. It was getting stronger, like a weight pressing down on my chest. And then it happened. Lily was about to throw a backflip, one of her signature moves. She launched herself into the air, her body twisting and flipping with perfect precision. But in the middle of her flip, the lights went out completely. The gym was plunged into darkness, and for a moment, everything was silent. The crowd stopped cheering, the music stopped playing, and all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. Then the lights flickered back on. The gym was exactly as it had been before, except for one thing: Lily was gone. At first, no one seemed to notice. The rest of the cheerleaders stood frozen, looking around in confusion. The crowd started murmuring, but it took a few moments for everyone to realize what had just happened. "Lily," one of the cheerleaders called, her voice shaky. "Where did she go?" But Lily was nowhere to be found. The gym erupted into chaos. The principal tried to calm everyone down, the football team rushed onto the floor, and the cheerleaders scattered, frantically searching for Lily, but she was gone. It was like she had vanished into thin air. I pushed my way through the crowd, my heart racing. I knew something was wrong. This wasn't just a prank or a stunt. Something had happened to Lily, something terrible. I found the spot where she had been standing before the lights went out. There was nothing there, no sign of her at all, just the cold, hard floor. "Where is she?" I heard someone shout. "She's got to be here somewhere," another voice said. But I knew better. Lily was gone. The rest of that day was a blur. The principal cancelled the rest of the rally, and the police were called in to search the school. They questioned everyone, but no one knew what had happened. The security cameras in the gym had malfunctioned, and the footage was useless. There were no witnesses, no clues, nothing. For weeks, the entire town was in an uproar. Search parties were organized, the news stations ran stories about Lily's disappearance, and everyone was talking about it. But no one could explain how a girl could just vanish in the middle of a crowded gym without a trace. I tried to move on, to focus on school and forget about what had happened, but it wasn't that easy. Every day I walked through the halls of Westbrook High, feeling like something was watching me. And every night I dreamed about that moment, the flicker of the lights, the sound of the crowd, and the empty spot on the gym floor where Lily had been. It wasn't until a month later that things got worse. I was sitting in the cafeteria with my friends trying to act normal when I got a text. It was from an unknown number, and it just said, "I'm still here." I stared at my phone, my hands shaking. I wanted to believe it was just a prank, that someone was messing with me, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside my window, like footsteps on the roof. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too real. Around midnight, my phone buzzed again. Another text from the same number. Come to the gym. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. I didn't want to go. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to stay away, but I couldn't ignore it. I
had to know. I grabbed my coat and slipped out of the house, my breath visible in the cold night air. The school was only a few blocks away, but the walk felt like it took hours. By the time I reached the front doors of Westbrook High, my legs
were shaking, and I could barely keep my hands steady. The gym was dark and empty, just like it had been the night Lily disappeared. I stood in the doorway, my pulse pounding in my ears. And then I saw her. She was standing at the far end of the gym, right where she had vanished. Her back was to me, her long blonde hair hanging loose around her shoulders. She was wearing the same cheer uniform from the day she disappeared. "Lily?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't move. I took a step forward, my heart in my throat. "Lily, is that you?" Slowly, she turned to face me, but it wasn't Lily, her face. It was distorted like a twisted version of her, with hollow, dark eyes and a smile that sent chills down my spine. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice echoing through the empty gym. I froze, my feet rooted to the spot. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. And then she vanished. The gym was empty again, just like before, but I knew what I had seen. It wasn't Lily, it was something else, something pretending to be her. I never told anyone about that night. I couldn't. No one would believe me. But I know the truth. Lily is still out there, somewhere. But she's not the same. And whatever is haunting Westbrook High, it's not going to stop. It's still here, waiting for its next victim. And I'm afraid I might be next. Mill Creek High School was built on a foundation of secrets. A sprawling, old brick building that had been standing since the early 1900s, it was the kind of place that had seen generations pass through its doors. Students joked about it being haunted, but no one ever took the rumors seriously, at least not until last year. I was a junior then, just another face in the sea of students trying to survive high school. My days were spent going from class to class, doing my homework, and hanging out with my friends Emily and Jake. None of us were particularly popular, but we weren't outcasts either. We were just your average high school kids doing what we could to get by without drawing too much attention to ourselves. But everything changed when the new gym opened. The old gym at Mill Creek had been falling apart for years. The roof leaked, the floors were warped, and the bleachers creaked with every step. So when the school board finally approved the construction of a brand new state of the art gymnasium, everyone was excited. It was a big deal, a fresh start for our crumbling school. Construction took almost 2 years, and when the new gym was finally finished, it was a sight to behold. Shiny hardwood floors, bright overhead lights, brand new lockers, and pristine bleachers. It was perfect. The first week of school, everyone was buzzing with excitement about it, especially the athletes, the basketball team, the volleyball team, the cheerleaders. Everyone was looking forward to using the new facility. And that's when the rumors started. It began as whispers, just like it always does, people saying they'd heard strange noises coming from the locker room late at
night.
Others claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving through the gym when it was supposed to be empty. Most of us brushed it off as typical high school gossip. After all, every old building has its ghost stories, right? But then things started happening. The first incident happened to a girl named Sarah. She was on the volleyball team, one of the first groups to start practicing in the new gym. One day after practice, she was in the locker room alone, getting ready to leave. According to her, the lights flickered, and when she looked in the mirror, she saw someone standing behind her. But when she turned around, no one was there. Sarah didn't stick around to investigate. She grabbed her stuff and ran out of the locker room as fast as she could. By the time she got to the parking lot, she was in tears, telling anyone who would listen about the shadowy figure she'd seen. Of course, most people didn't believe her. They said she was just tired from practice. Maybe her eyes were playing tricks on her. But Sarah was convinced that something wasn't right about that gym. After that, she refused to go back in there alone. Then it happened again. This time, it was one of the basketball players, a guy named Ethan. He was staying late after school to shoot hoops, trying to get some extra practice in before the big game. According to Ethan, he was the only one in the gym that night, at least. That's what he thought. He said he was shooting free throws when he heard the sound of someone running behind him. He turned around, but there was no one there. The gym was completely empty. He went back to his game, but the footsteps kept coming, getting closer and closer until they were right behind him. Ethan ran out of the gym, leaving his basketball behind. He never told anyone what he saw, but after that, he refused to stay late for practice anymore. By now, the rumors were impossible to ignore. People started talking about how the new gym had been built on top of the old school's basement, a part of the building that had been sealed off for decades. No one knew why it had been closed, but the stories ranged from accidental deaths during construction to cover-ups of something darker. One thing was clear, something wasn't right about that gym. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Emily, Jake and I started talking
about it more, trying to figure out if there was any truth to the rumors.
Jake, being the adventurous one, suggested we check it out for ourselves. I wasn't exactly thrilled about the idea, but curiosity got the better of me. We agreed to go after school one Friday when most of the students and staff had already left for the weekend. It was risky. If we got caught, we'd be in serious trouble, but we were determined to get to the bottom of whatever was happening in that gym. That afternoon, we waited until the halls were clear before sneaking into the gym. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the overhead lights. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Jake led the way, of course, with Emily and me following closely behind. We made our way toward the locker room, our footsteps echoing in the empty space. When we reached the door, Jake hesitated for a moment before pushing it open. The locker room was just as we'd expected, bright, clean, and empty. But there was something about it that made my skin crawl. Maybe it was the fact that Sarah had seen something in here? Or maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. Jake, ever the fearless leader, walked over to the row of lockers and started opening them one by one. "Come on, guys, there's nothing." "Here," he said, his voice bouncing off the tile walls. Emily and I exchanged a nervous glance, but we didn't say anything. We both knew better than to argue with Jake when he got like this. But then, as Jake opened one of the lockers, something strange happened. The lights flickered. Just for a second, the room was plunged into darkness, and when the lights came back on, everything looked the same. Except for one thing, there was writing on the mirror. I didn't see who noticed it first, but suddenly all three of us were staring at the mirror on the far wall where someone, or something, had scrawled the words, "Leave now," in what looked like red lipstick. My heart started racing, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. "Jake, we need to get out of here," I whispered. my voice barely audible. But Jake just stood there, staring at the mirror like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. "Jake!" Emily grabbed his arm, pulling him toward the door. "We need to go now." That's when we heard it. A loud bang from behind us, like something had slammed into one of the lockers. We all spun around, but there was no one there, just rows of lockers, silent and still. And then the banging started again, louder this time, coming from multiple directions at once. Without another word, the three of us bolted for the door. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath in the cool evening air. None of us said anything for a long time, just stood there in shock, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Jake was the first to speak. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, my heart still pounding in my chest. "But whatever it was, I don't think it wanted us there." We never went back to the gym after
that. The rumors continued to spread, but we kept our experience to ourselves. Whatever was haunting that place, it was real, and we weren't about to go looking for it again.
But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I still hear the sound of footsteps echoing in the empty halls of Mill Creek High. And I wonder if whatever was in that gym is still there, waiting for its next victim. Because one thing is for sure, Mill Creek High has its secrets, and some of them are better left buried. Millbrook High School, a place that seemed so ordinary, a typical American high school where students bustled through hallways, lockers slammed shut, and life unfolded in predictable patterns. But deep within its structure, in the farthest reaches of its old wing, a secret lay hidden. A secret so dark that only whispers of its existence ever made their way out into the light. This secret resided in the heart of the chemistry lab, a room notorious for eerie occurrences that had plagued the school for decades, and one fateful night my friends and I became tangled in its terrifying grasp. It was my senior year at Millbrook, and like every other student nearing the end of their high school life, I had grown bored. Bored of the same classes, the same people, the same mundane routine. My friends, Brandon, Jessica, and I, often talked about shaking things up, doing something reckless, something thrilling before we all graduated and went our separate ways. We'd all heard about the chemistry lab's spooky reputation, students whispering about flickering lights, strange noises, and even shadows that didn't belong to anyone. It was perfect for a bit of adrenaline. Jessica was the first one to suggest that we investigate the lab at night after everyone had gone home. Brandon, being the impulsive risk-taker he always was, immediately agreed. I wasn't so sure. I'd always been more cautious, and stories of haunted school buildings didn't exactly scream fun to me, but they both goaded me, saying it would be a last hurrah before we left for college. I eventually caved in. We made our plan on a Thursday. It was simple enough. Meet in the parking lot after 9 p.m. when the janitors had finished their rounds, sneak in through the back entrance near the science wing, and head straight for the chemistry lab. The old wing wasn't locked up as tightly as the newer parts of the school, and we knew the janitors didn't check it as often because the classes there had been moved to the modern building years ago. As the day wore on, I started to get a bad feeling. It wasn't fear exactly, more like an unshakable sense that we were going to regret this, but I pushed it aside, convincing myself that I was just being overly cautious. At 9:15 that night, we were all standing in the shadow of the massive oak tree near the back entrance, whispering and giggling nervously like kids pulling off a prank. Brandon led the way, picking the lock on the old door with a credit card like he'd seen in countless YouTube videos. It took him longer than expected, but eventually we were inside. The atmosphere inside the old wing was entirely different from the rest of the school. The air was thick with dust, the kind that made you want to sneeze with every breath. The lights in the hallway flickered weakly, casting long, wavering shadows across the cracked linoleum floor. It was silent too. Silent. No hum of vending machines or distant chatter from the janitorial staff. Just nothing. We made our way through the narrow hallway, our footsteps echoing unnervingly in the empty building. Brandon, naturally, walked ahead, while Jessica and I followed, trying not to spook ourselves. As we approached the door to the chemistry lab, I could feel my pulse quickening. The lab door was slightly ajar, something I hadn't expected. I shot a glance at Brandon, who raised an eyebrow but said nothing as he pushed the door open. The room itself was like any other chemistry lab, long counters lined with Bunsen burners, glass beakers stacked haphazardly on the shelves, and stools neatly tucked beneath the workstations. But it felt wrong, like the room was waiting for something. For us, maybe. I told myself it was just my imagination running wild, but there was no denying the shift in the air. It was colder in here too, not freezing, but colder than it should have been for a spring night. Brandon strode into the center of the room, acting like he owned the place, while Jessica and I hesitated near the door. "Okay, so what now?" whispered, not wanting to break the unnatural stillness that clung to the room. "Now we find out what all the fuss is about," Brandon grinned, pulling out his phone to record the whole thing. He panned the camera around the room, narrating in his best horror movie voice. "Here we are, in the most haunted part of Millbrook High." "Brandon, shut up," Jessica hissed. "This isn't a joke." But he didn't listen. He started walking around, pretending to investigate, knocking on the walls, even opening one of the cupboards to prove that nothing was hiding inside. That's when it happened. One of the glass beakers, sitting innocently on the counter, slid across the surface on its own. I froze. I know what I saw. There was no wind, no draft, nothing that could have moved it. "Did you guys see that?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Yeah," Jessica whispered, her eyes wide with fear. Even Brandon, always the skeptic, had stopped grinning. "It's just a trick of the light," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. But then the beaker fell off the counter and shattered on the floor. And that was just the beginning, before we could process what had just happened. The lights overhead flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for several long seconds before blinking back to life. In the brief moments of darkness, I thought I saw something, movement in the shadows, something lurking in the corners of the room. My heart pounded in my chest and I grabbed Jessica's arm. "We need to leave," I whispered urgently, but my voice sounded foreign in my ears, like it wasn't mine. Suddenly, the door to the supply closet in the corner of the room slammed shut, even though no one had touched it. Brandon jumped, his bravado crumbling as he stumbled back toward us. "Okay, maybe we should go," he said, his voice tight with
fear. We backed toward the exit, but before we could reach the door, every single cabinet in the room flew open with a loud bang. Beakers and test tubes crashed to the floor, shattering into a million tiny shards. The air grew heavier, almost oppressive, and it was becoming harder to breathe. Jessica was practically clinging to me now, her face pale with terror. Then we heard it, a low, guttural whisper coming from somewhere in the room. "Get out." That was all we needed to hear. Without a second thought, we bolted for the door. But as soon as Brandon reached for the handle, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. We were trapped. Panic set in, my heart hammering in my chest as I frantically searched for another way out. But there was no other door, no window we could open.
We were stuck in the lab, with whatever was in there with us. The lights began flickering again, casting the room in intermittent shadows. In those brief moments of darkness, I saw them, figures shadowy and indistinct, moving in the periphery of my vision, but every time the lights came back on, they were gone. "What do we do?" Jessica cried, her voice barely audible over the sound of glass crunching beneath our feet. Brandon was silent for a moment, his face as white as a sheet. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice trembling. And then the whispering started again. This time it was louder, more insistent. "Out! Out! Get out!" The voices seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing off the walls, surrounding us. "We have to break the door down," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "It's
our only chance." Brandon nodded, and together we threw ourselves against the door with all our strength.
The first attempt barely budged it, but after 3 or 4 tries, the door finally gave way with a loud crack. We stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath, and without looking back, we ran. We didn't stop running until we were outside, standing under the cold, clear night sky, our hearts racing, our bodies shaking with adrenaline. None of us spoke for a long time, too scared to even process what had just happened. Finally, Jessica broke the silence. "What the hell was that?"
"I don't know," Brandon said quietly, staring back at the building, as if it might reach out and pull us back inside. We never spoke about that night again. Not to each other, not to anyone. We told ourselves that we'd imagined it, that it
Had been some sort of collective hallucination brought on by our own fear and excitement. But deep down, I knew the truth. The chemistry lab was haunted, and whatever lived in there didn't want us poking around. A few weeks later, the old wing was officially closed off for good. The administration said it was due to structural issues, but I knew better. They were keeping something locked inside, something that had been disturbed when they built the
new wing. I don't know what we unleashed that night, but I do know this. Some places are better left alone. And Millbrook High's chemistry lab is one of them.
The last place I ever expected to experience true horror was my high school. But what happened in the forgotten wing of our school will haunt me for the rest of my life. I never believed in the paranormal or in the rumors that circulated about the closed-off section of Rockvale High. It was just another hallway, I thought, a forgotten part of the school that nobody used anymore. But that was before I saw it with my own eyes. Now, I'm not so sure what I believe. It started as a joke, something to do out of boredom during our final year. My group of friends, Tom, Sabrina and Jenny, were always looking for thrills, ways to entertain ourselves in the slow, dull days leading up to graduation. We had all heard the stories about the old wing at the far end of the school. It had been closed for years with no one allowed inside. The school claimed it was due to asbestos or some other structural issue, but the rumors were far more interesting. Students whispered about strange noises coming from the wing late at night, about figures seen moving behind the windows when no one was supposed to be there. Some even said that a student had gone missing there years ago and was never found, but like most high school rumors, it was just a tale passed down to scare the freshmen. We didn't believe any of it, not really. But one Friday afternoon, after classes had let out and the school was nearly empty, Tom brought it up again. We were sitting on the bleachers by the football field, watching the sun sink lower in the sky, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It had been a lazy day, the kind where nothing exciting seemed to happen. "Hey," Tom said, grinning mischievously. "Why don't we check out the old wing tonight?" Sabrina rolled her eyes, clearly not impressed. "That place is boarded up. How are we supposed to get in?" "I heard there's a window in the back that's still loose," Tom replied, leaning in with that familiar gleam in his eye that always meant trouble. "We could get in through there. Come on, it'll be fun. We can finally see if all those stories are true." Jenny, always up for a bit of excitement, grinned. "I'm in. I've always wanted to see what's back there." Sabrina sighed, but even she couldn't resist. "Fine, but if we get caught, I'm blaming you, Tom." I hesitated, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The old wing had always freaked me out a little, but I didn't want to be the only one backing out. Besides, it would just be an empty hallway. Nothing to worry about, right? "All right," I said, finally. "I'm in." We met up later that night after the janitors had finished their rounds. The school was quiet, eerily so, with only the distant hum of the air conditioning units breaking the silence. The back entrance to the school was unlocked. Tom had seen to that earlier in the day, and we slipped inside unnoticed. The hallway leading to the old wing was dimly lit, with only a few flickering bulbs casting long shadows on the floor. As we made our way toward the boarded, up doors, the air grew colder. The temperature drop was noticeable, and I rubbed my arms to ward off the chill. Sabrina, who was walking beside me, shivered and muttered something about it being colder than usual for late spring. Tom led us around the side of the wing, where, sure enough, one of the windows was loose. With some effort, he pried it open, and one by one, we climbed through into the old wing. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It was stale, like a room that hadn't been opened in years, with a faint hint of something rotting. Dust clung to every surface, and cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten decorations. The hallway stretched out before us, long and narrow, with doors on either side leading to empty classrooms. The only sound was the faint echo of our footsteps as we made our way deeper into the wing. The atmosphere was oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, though I told myself it was just nerves. "This place is creepy as hell," Jenny whispered, her voice barely audible in the thick silence. "Yeah, no kidding," Sabrina agreed, her usual bravado nowhere to be found. Tom, however, seemed unfazed. He led the way with his flashlight, peering into the darkened classrooms as we passed. Most of them were empty, just old desks and chairs covered in dust, but something about the place felt off. It was as if the building had absorbed the years of neglect, turning it into something wrong. We came to the end of the hallway, where a single door stood slightly ajar. Unlike the others, this one didn't look like it had been touched in years. The wood was warped and cracked, and a faded sign on the door read Room 314. Tom, always the daring one, pushed the door open without hesitation. The room beyond was small, barely more than a storage closet, but it was what was inside that sent a chill down my spine. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols that looked like they had been scratched into the plaster with something sharp. In the center of the room, a single desk stood, and on it sat an old notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "Whoa, what is this?" Jenny asked, stepping into the room behind Tom. "I don't know," Tom replied, picking up the notebook and flipping through the pages. "Looks like someone was writing in here a long time ago." Sabrina and I exchanged uneasy glances, the knot in my stomach tightening. There was something about the symbols on the walls that unnerved me, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. They were crude, almost childlike, but they exuded a sense of malice. "Let's get out of here," Sabrina said suddenly. "This place is giving me the creeps." "Wait, I want to see what's in the notebook," Tom insisted, his eyes scanning the pages. I moved closer to him, peering over his shoulder. The handwriting was messy, scrawled in a shaky hand, and the entries seemed to be ramblings, disjointed thoughts about the school, the teachers, and something called the Watcher. "What the hell is the Watcher?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Tom shook his head. "I don't know, but it sounds like whoever wrote this was losing it." As he flipped to the last page, I noticed something else, a drawing, crude and hurried, of a figure standing in the doorway of what looked like the very room we were in. The figure was tall and dark, its features indistinguishable, but there was something about it that filled me with dread. "Okay, we're done here,"
I said, my voice shaking. "Let's go!"
But as we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Jenny screamed, and Tom dropped the notebook, his face pale with fear. Sabrina grabbed the doorknob and twisted it, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. The temperature in the room plummeted, and the air grew thick with an almost tangible sense of malevolence. I could feel it. Something was in the room with us, watching, waiting. The symbols on the walls seemed to pulse, as if they were alive, and the sound of scratching filled the air. It was coming from behind the walls, slow and deliberate, like something trying to claw its way out. "We need to get out of here," I said, my voice trembling. "Help me with the door!" Sabrina shouted, but no matter how hard we pulled or pushed, it wouldn't open. Then the whispering started. Low, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a voice, no voices, speaking in a language I didn't understand, but the intent was clear. They wanted us gone, or worse. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and for a brief moment the figure from the drawing was there, standing in the doorway. Tall, dark, and featureless, it loomed over us, its presence suffocating. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The door burst open, and we didn't waste a second. We ran, tearing down the hallway as fast as our legs could carry us. I didn't dare look back, afraid of what I might see. We didn't stop running until we were outside, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. None of us spoke, as we stood there, staring back at the school. The old wing was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened, but we knew better. We had felt it, seen it. Something was in there, something that had been waiting for years. We never spoke about.
That night again.
The school eventually demolished the old wing, claiming it was for safety reasons, but I knew the truth. They were trying to bury something that should never have been disturbed. But even now, years later, I still dream about that hallway, about the symbols on the walls, and about the Watcher standing in the doorway, waiting, always waiting. It all started when I got assigned to the midnight shift at More Tech Industries, the largest tech company in our city. I worked as an IT support technician, and we rotated shifts to provide 24/7 service. Most nights were quiet, and I didn't mind the extra pay. But the night I found myself alone on the 13th floor, my view of the company changed forever. More Tech was a towering glass and steel structure, modern and sleek, with offices filled with the hum of computers and servers. The 13th floor was the highest, where the senior management offices and archives were located. The floor had been off limits for months due to renovations, and no one was supposed to go up there. But that night, something went wrong with the servers in the building, and all the systems tied to the 13th floor went down. My boss, Marcus, called me at around 11:30 p.m., waking me from the brief nap I'd managed to squeeze in between monitoring tickets. "Jackson, we've got a situation," Marcus said, his voice sounding unusually tense. "We've lost connection to the 13th floor's server racks and there's no remote fix. You'll need to go up there and check it out." I rubbed my eyes, still groggy, and glanced at the clock. "The 13th floor? I thought that place was off limits. It's just a routine check. Just reboot the system and come back down. Shouldn't take more than 10 minutes. Don't worry, Jackson. You'll be fine." I sighed, knowing I had no choice. I grabbed my equipment, donned my company-issued badge, and took the elevator up. As the doors closed and I watched the numbers climb, a strange sense of unease settled in the pit of my stomach. The 13th floor had always been a bit of a mystery. There were stories floating around about things that had happened up there, strange occurrences late at night, whispers in empty offices, but they were just that. Stories. Or so I thought. When the elevator doors opened, I was greeted by silence. The entire floor was pitch black, the only light coming from the emergency exit sign glowing faintly at the end of the hallway. I stepped out, my footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The 13th floor was much like the rest of the building, modern, with sleek glass walls and chrome finishes. But there was something different about it. The air felt heavier, and there was a distinct chill that seemed out of place for a building with climate control. I glanced around, looking for the server room, but all the offices were locked, the glass walls opaque, giving no hint of what lay inside. I followed the hallway, feeling a growing sense of unease with every step. Something wasn't right. There was a strange hum in the air, faint but persistent, like a low electrical buzz, but it didn't sound like anything I had heard in the building before. Finally, I found the server room. The door was slightly ajar, the flicker of dim emergency lights illuminating the racks of equipment inside. I hesitated before pushing it open fully, the hinges creaking as the door swung wide. The room was empty, just rows of servers blinking in and out of sync. I knelt down to inspect the system. "Let's just get this over with," I muttered to myself as I reached for the power button to reboot the main server. Just as I did, the lights flickered, plunging the room into complete darkness. My flashlight went out at the same time, leaving me in the pitch-black room. I swore under my breath, fumbling to turn it back on, but the light wouldn't work. I felt a cold draft of air sweep through the room, though there were no windows or vents open. Suddenly the hum I'd heard earlier grew louder, morphing into a low, unsettling vibration. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, but enough to freeze me in place. "Jackson!" I spun around, heart pounding in my chest. The voice sounded distant but unmistakable, like it was coming from the hallway. I grabbed my flashlight, which finally flickered back to life, and hurried to the door, peeking out into the hallway. It was empty, the emergency lights casting long, ominous shadows across the floor. I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone had called my name. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was one of the janitors or another employee, but it didn't make sense. I was supposed to be the only one on this floor. Still, I couldn't just stand there. I needed to finish the job and get out. I quickly rebooted the server, my hands shaking slightly, and stood up to leave. But as I stepped into the hallway, the elevator at the far end dinged, the doors sliding open. I stopped in my tracks. The building was empty, there was no one else here. But someone, or something, had just called the elevator. I aimed my flashlight at the open doors, but no one stepped out. The elevator stood there, open and waiting. My pulse quickened, and I debated whether I should just take the stairs down, but the staircase was all the way on the other side of the building. I took a hesitant step toward the elevator when I heard the whisper again. "Jackson!" This time it was right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating nothing but the empty hallway. My breath caught in my throat. The cold draft returned, this time stronger, almost as if something was passing by me. I felt a presence, something unseen but undeniably there. The whisper grew louder, a chorus of voices now, all saying my name over and over, as if beckoning me to follow. I bolted. I ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the silence, but no matter how fast I went, the whispers seemed to follow, growing louder and more insistent. I reached the elevator and jammed the button, praying for it to close. The doors slid shut, and I slumped against the wall, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The voices stopped as suddenly as they had started, leaving me in heavy, suffocating silence. I rode the elevator down to the ground floor, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. As soon as the doors opened, I ran out, into the lobby, not stopping until I was outside in the crisp night air. I didn't go back to the 13th floor that night, and the next morning I handed in my resignation. Whatever was up there, whatever those whispers were, I wanted nothing to do with it. Weeks later, I learned that the 13th floor had been shut down for a reason. Years ago, there had been an accident, an electrical fire in the server room that claimed the lives of 2 employees. The building had been renovated since, but some say the spirits of those who died never left. They linger in the forgotten corners of the floor, whispering, waiting for someone to hear them. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, but I know what I heard that night. And I'll never set foot in that building again, not after the midnight shift files found me. It was a cold December night, the kind that made your breath hang in the air like a cloud. I had just settled into my desk for yet another late night shift. Being the junior on the team meant that I was the one stuck with the graveyard hours, trying to catch up on endless tasks while the rest of the office basked in their warm homes. Our company's office was on the 19th floor of a sleek, modern corporate tower surrounded by steel and glass high above the city. It felt more like a fortress in the sky than a place of work. As usual, the office was completely empty, the faint hum of computers and the occasional creak of the building my only companions. I wasn't sure why, but the place always felt different at night. It was the same space I spent 8 hours a day in, yet the quiet and the darkness transformed it into something unsettling. The bright fluorescent lights, usually harsh and unforgiving, now flickered sporadically, casting long shadows across the rows of empty desks. I shivered slightly, not just from the cold, but from the eerie sensation of being watched. It was the same feeling I had felt the past few nights, but I had brushed it off as just paranoia. After all, I was alone. There couldn't possibly be anyone here. I tried to focus on the report I was working on, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Suddenly the overhead lights flickered again, this time more violently, plunging the office into a brief moment of darkness. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, staring at my computer screen, which was now the only source of light in the room. The hum of the air conditioning seemed to grow louder, filling the silence with an unnerving drone. I let out a shaky breath, convincing myself it was just a power surge. But then I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. My stomach tightened as I slowly turned my head, scanning the empty office. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind outside, but the whispers grew louder, closer, like someone was standing just behind me, speaking in low, hurried tones. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping loudly against the floor, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife.
"Is anyone there?" I called out, my voice shaking slightly. There was no response, just the echo of my voice bouncing off the walls. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my nerves. The logical part of my brain told me it was just my imagination.
But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Forcing myself to sit back down, I tried to ignore the uneasy sensation creeping up my spine. I opened my email, determined to distract myself with work, but the whispers returned, clearer this time. They were faint, almost like a distant conversation, but I couldn't make out the words. My heart pounded in my chest as I glanced around. The office again, my eyes darting between the rows of cubicles. Then I saw it, movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned sharply, staring at the far end of the office, but there was nothing there. Just rows of empty desks bathed in the dim glow of the emergency lights. But I was sure I had seen something, or someone. I stood up again, this time more cautiously, and made my way toward the back of the office. My footsteps echoed loudly. In the silence, each one sending a jolt of fear through me. As I reached the break room, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the light switch. I flipped it, but the room remained dark. The light bulb was out. Taking a deep breath, I stepped into the darkness, my phone flashlight guiding my way. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the office, and the shadows seemed to move unnaturally, twisting and writhing in the corners. I scanned the room, my heart racing, but it was empty. That's when I heard it, a loud, crashing sound from behind me. I spun around, nearly dropping my phone, and rushed back to the main office. My desk was in shambles, papers scattered everywhere, and my chair was tipped over. My computer screen flickered, the faint light casting a ghostly glow across the room. I stood frozen in place, my mind racing with confusion and fear. There was no one else in the building, there couldn't be. But then I heard it again, the whispers. Louder this time, more frantic. They seemed to be coming from all around me, closing in. Panicking, I grabbed my bag and bolted for the elevator. My hands shook as I hit the button, glancing nervously over my shoulder. The whispers were growing louder, more distinct. I could hear voices now, multiple voices speaking in hushed, hurried
tones, but I still couldn't make out the words. The elevator dinged, and the doors slid open. I rushed inside, hitting the button for the lobby, my heart pounding in my chest.
As the doors began to close, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, an indistinct figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the office. I blinked, my breath catching in my throat, but the doors shut before I could get a better look. I slumped against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. My mind raced with 1,000 questions. What had I just seen? What were those whispers? The elevator descended slowly, the soft hum of the machinery doing little to calm my nerves. When the doors finally opened, I bolted out into the lobby, the bright lights of the building's entrance, a stark contrast to the darkness of the office above. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. I stood there for a moment, catching my breath before pulling out my phone to call my boss. I didn't care if I sounded crazy, I wasn't going back up there alone. The next day I told my manager everything. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss my story. Instead, he sighed heavily and gave me a tired look. "You're not the first one to experience something like that," he said quietly. "There have been incidents, especially at night." My blood ran cold as he explained. Apparently, several employees had reported strange occurrences during the night shift, whispers, cold drafts, and the sensation of being watched. Some even claimed to have seen figures in the shadows. Management had tried to keep it quiet, not wanting to cause a panic, but word had gotten around. I wasn't sure what to believe. Part of me wanted to think it was all just some elaborate prank or mass hysteria. But after what I had experienced, I knew there was something more to it. Something in that office wasn't right. I never worked the night shift again after that. In fact, I started looking for a new job not long after. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was haunting that office wasn't finished with me. To this day, I still hear those whispers in my dreams, faint and distant, like a conversation just out of reach. And every time I walk past that building, I can't help but glance up at the 19th floor, wondering if the ghosts of the night shift are still there, waiting for their next victim. It was just another day at the office, or at least that's how it began. I worked for a mid-sized tech company in downtown Seattle, nestled in a sleek skyscraper with floor-to-ceiling glass windows that provided a view of the bustling city below. It was the kind of office that seemed so modern and efficient, open plan, lots of natural light, and pristine white walls. Nothing about it screamed haunted or even strange. But things changed the day I started staying late for overtime. It began about a month ago. I had fallen behind on my work and volunteered to stay after hours to catch up. The office was always lively during the day, with constant chatter and the sound of fingers tapping on keyboards. But at night, it was a different place entirely. The only sound that filled the silence was the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional ding of the elevator far down the hallway. The sleek, modern office that felt so inviting in the daylight suddenly felt cold and sterile after dark. My desk was tucked away in a corner, near one of the large glass walls that overlooked the city. At night, the view became a reflective, black mirror showing only the inside of the office, with the occasional flicker of car lights far below. I had spent a few nights there before without anything strange happening, so I never expected the office to feel different. But that particular Friday evening, something about the atmosphere felt off. It started small. The first strange occurrence was around 10 p.m., long after everyone else had gone home. I was reviewing some client data when I heard a soft thud from across the room. I glanced up, expecting to see someone from the cleaning crew, but there was no one there. The open plan office stretched out before me, completely empty except for the rows of desks and chairs, bathed in the soft glow of the emergency lights. I shrugged it off. It was an old building. Noises were bound to happen. But then I heard it again. This time, the sound was closer, like someone tapping on the glass wall behind me. Slowly I turned around to face the window, but all I saw was my own reflection staring back at me. Beyond that, there was nothing but the dark expanse of the city. The tapping continued, faint but persistent. I stood up and walked over to the window, pressing my hands against the cool glass, trying to peer through the reflection. That's when I saw it, a shadow, faint and indistinct, standing just behind me. My breath caught in my throat as I spun around, but the office was empty. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the empty room, convinced that someone had been standing there just moments ago. But there was no one, just the rows of empty desks, their chairs pushed neatly under them. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as a trick of the light. But the nagging feeling of unease remained, crawling under my skin like a persistent itch. I sat back down at my desk, trying to focus on my work, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced up, I half expected to see someone standing there, just out of sight. But there was never anyone there. The office was empty, except for me. The clock ticked closer to midnight, and I was almost done with my work when I heard the sound again, this time a soft, distant whisper. My blood ran cold as I strained to listen, but the words were too faint to make out. It was like someone was talking in the next room, just beyond the glass partition, but I knew there was no one else in the office. I stood up, grabbing my phone and flashlight, and made my way toward the back of the office where the sound seemed to be coming from. My footsteps echoed loudly in the silence as I passed row after row of empty desks. The whispering grew louder, but still I couldn't make
out the words.
When I reached the back of the office, I found myself standing in front of the conference room, its glass walls reflecting the faint light from the hallway. The door was slightly ajar, and the whispering seemed to be coming from inside. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, before slowly pushing the door open. The room was empty. The long conference table stretched out before me, its surface gleaming under the dim light. The chairs were all neatly arranged, and there was no sign of anyone. But the whispering continued, growing louder now, like it was surrounding me. My
hands trembled as I scanned the room, my flashlight darting from corner to corner, but there was nothing, no one.
I was about to turn and leave when something caught my eye. One of the chairs at the far end of the table was slowly spinning, as if someone had just stood up from it. My breath hitched as I stared at the chair, frozen in place. The whispering grew louder still, filling the room with a sense of dread that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang, and the lights flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. My phone's flashlight flickered wildly as I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I fumbled for the door, yanking it open and rushing out into the
hallway. My footsteps echoed loudly as I sprinted back to my desk, grabbing my bag and jacket.
I wasn't going to stick around to find out what was going on. Whatever was in that office, I wanted no part of it. As I made my way to the elevator, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The shadows seemed to shift and move out of the corner of my eye, and every time I glanced back, I thought I saw something, someone standing just out of sight. But when I looked directly, there was nothing. The elevator doors finally slid open, and I rushed inside, hitting the button for the ground floor. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of the office. For a brief moment, I saw a figure standing in the shadows near my desk, a tall, indistinct shape that vanished the moment the doors shut. I never returned to that office after that night. I handed in my resignation the following Monday and found another job in a different building, far from the cold glass walls of that cursed tower. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispering. It haunts my dreams, following me even after I've left that place behind. And every time I pass by that building, I can't help but wonder, what did I see that night? And is it still there, waiting for someone else to stay after hours, alone in the dark? It had been a few months since I started working for a high-end marketing agency in the heart of the city. The office was a sprawling maze of glass walls, conference rooms, and open workstations, each meticulously designed to fit the company's polished aesthetic. The first few weeks were overwhelming, adjusting to the fast-paced environment and juggling multiple clients. But the company perks were impressive: fancy coffee machines, state-of-the-art technology, and best of all, the office was located on the 40th floor, providing a breathtaking view of the skyline. Everything seemed perfect, at least until we were assigned to work on a major client project. The deadlines were tight, and our small team had no choice but to pull late hours in the office. My colleagues, Michael, Lauren, and David, were in the same boat, working overtime every evening to make sure everything was in order. It was exhausting, but we were committed to delivering the best. The turning point came one evening, just after 9 p.m. We had all gathered in one of the larger conference rooms for a final review before presenting to the client the next morning. It was a sleek room with a massive oak table dominating the space, surrounded by 10 high-backed leather chairs. At the far end of the room was a large floor, 2 ceiling glass window, offering a panoramic view of the city. The soft, ambient lighting from the skyscrapers below painted the room in a calm, warm glow, and at first it seemed like any other late night session. But the strange atmosphere that followed was something none of us could have predicted. It started when Michael, our project lead, noticed something odd on the conference room's digital whiteboard. We were going over some campaign strategies when the screen flickered, the lights above dimming momentarily. We all paused, exchanging confused glances, but when everything returned to normal, we assumed it was just a glitch. Guess the systems.
Tired too, Lauren joked, forcing a laugh. I nodded, though something in the room felt off.
The temperature seemed to drop slightly, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me, trying to shake off the sudden chill. Michael pressed on, going over the rest of the presentation slides, but I noticed that his usual confidence had waned. He kept glancing toward the glass window, as if expecting to see something there. It wasn't long before we all started to feel the shift. The air in the room felt heavier, like something oppressive was settling over us. A strange, low hum filled the space, not loud enough to be alarming, but just persistent enough to be unnerving. At first, I thought it was coming from the building's HVAC system, but then David, who was sitting closest to the window, mentioned it. "Do you guys hear that?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. He glanced around the room, waiting for someone to confirm he wasn't losing it. Lauren and I exchanged uneasy looks, but I nodded. "Yeah, I've been hearing it too, like a low hum or something." Michael frowned, clearly irritated. "It's just the air conditioning," he said, though I could hear the edge in his voice. David shook his head. "No, it's something else. Listen." We all went quiet. And that's when we heard it, a faint, whispering sound, almost imperceptible at first, but growing clearer by the second. It was like a low murmur, as if someone was speaking just beyond the glass wall, but no words were discernible. I turned toward the window, half expecting to see someone standing outside, but there was no one there, just the empty cityscape stretching out into the night. "That's not the AC," Lauren whispered, her face pale. Michael stood up, clearly unnerved but trying to maintain control. "All right, let's wrap this up. We've been here too."
Long? He was right. We had been pushing ourselves hard, and exhaustion was setting in. But something about that whispering unsettled me. It wasn't just fatigue, it was something else, something more sinister.
We gathered our things and Michael reached for the door handle to leave, but when he tried to pull the door open, it wouldn't budge. "Locked?" he muttered, confused. He yanked harder, but the door didn't move. David stepped up to help, but even with both of them pulling, the door remained firmly shut. "It's not locked from this side," David said, frowning. "It shouldn't be stuck." We all exchanged nervous glances. This was a high-tech office. None of the doors could be manually locked from inside the room. Everything was controlled electronically. There was no reason for the door to be stuck. "Try the emergency button," Lauren suggested, pointing to the small red button near the door that could override the electronic lock in case of a power outage. Michael pressed it, but nothing happened. The door remained closed. Now even he looked shaken. "Okay," he said, his voice tense. "Let's not panic. I'll call security." He pulled out his phone, but as he dialed, the whispering grew louder. It was no longer a soft murmur, but a full, blown conversation, though the words were still unintelligible. The sound filled the room, bouncing off the walls, making it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "We're not alone in here," Lauren said, her voice trembling. I glanced at her, feeling the same icy fear settling in my stomach. She was right. There was something in the room with us, something we couldn't see. My heart raced as I tried to steady my breathing. Michael's call went straight to voicemail. "What the hell is going on?" he muttered, his frustration giving way to fear. Suddenly the lights flickered, and for a brief moment the whispering stopped. We all stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Then, without warning, the lights went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Lauren let out a small scream, and I could hear David fumbling for his phone, its flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. "We need to get out of here," Michael said, his voice low but urgent. "Now!" We all rushed toward the door, trying everything, pulling, pushing, even kicking it, but it wouldn't budge. Panic set in as the whispering returned, louder and more aggressive than before. It sounded as if multiple voices were speaking all at once, their words overlapping in a chaotic chorus that made my skin crawl. I backed away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I noticed something moving in the reflection of the glass window. At first, I thought it was just my own reflection, but then I saw it, another figure standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. "Did you see that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. Lauren nodded, her face white as a sheet. "I saw it too. There's someone in here with us." The whispering grew louder, and now it sounded like it was coming from all directions. Shadows danced on the walls, moving in unnatural ways, and the temperature dropped even further, leaving us shivering in the dark. Shivering. "We need to find another way out," David said, his voice trembling. Michael, still trying to stay in control, nodded. "Check the windows." We all rushed to the large glass window that overlooked the city, but there was no way to open it. It was solid, unbreakable glass, designed to withstand strong winds and pressure from the outside. We were trapped. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, the whispering turned into a loud, guttural moan, and the room seemed to vibrate with a strange energy. The glass walls around us began to rattle, and the shadows on the walls grew darker, more defined. Then we heard it, a loud bang, followed by a deep, throaty laugh that echoed through the room. "What the hell is that?" Lauren screamed, backing away from the window. I didn't know. None of us did. The lights flickered back on, but the atmosphere in the room remained tense. The whispering had stopped, but the sense of dread lingered, hanging over us like a dark cloud. We all stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Then, slowly, the door creaked open, as if on its own. We didn't waste any time. We rushed out of the conference room and into the hallway, not stopping, until we reached the elevator. None of us spoke on the way down to the lobby. We didn't need to. We all knew something unexplainable had happened in that room, something that defied logic and reason. The next morning, I handed in my resignation. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what else might happen. Whatever was in that conference room, I wanted no part of it. But even now, weeks later, I still hear the whispering in my dreams. It follows me, haunting me with the memory of that night. I don't know what we encountered in that office, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never work late in a corporate building again. Working at a large law firm, the hours are brutal. I had just passed my second anniversary at the firm, and I was still one of the junior associates trying to make a name for myself. The pressure to bill more hours, get noticed by the partners, and make it through the never-ending workload was suffocating. So, when I was assigned a major case, I knew I had no choice but to pull late nights, even if that meant being the last one in the office. It was a Friday evening, and the office was deserted. Most people had gone home by 7 p.m., and I was one of the few left in the building. My desk was on the 17th floor, tucked in a corner cubicle with a panoramic view of the city's skyline. At night, the city lights reflected off the floor, 2 ceiling windows, creating an oddly beautiful but isolating atmosphere. I wasn't completely alone, though. I knew the cleaning crew usually came around 10 p.m., and sometimes security would make their rounds. That thought gave me some comfort as I stared at the pile of case files in front of me. I had to review deposition transcripts and prepare arguments for a Monday morning meeting, and I wasn't even close to finishing. Around 9:30 p.m., I heard the distant hum of the elevator doors opening down the hall. I assumed it was the cleaning crew starting their rounds. I didn't pay much attention to it and kept working, fully engrossed in the legal documents. A few minutes later, I heard soft footsteps echoing through the hallway. The building had an eerie stillness at night, so every sound seemed amplified. The footsteps stopped near my cubicle, and I glanced up, expecting to see one of the janitors, but there was no one there. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination. Maybe the sound had come from farther down the hallway, and I had just misjudged its proximity. I went back to work, trying to focus on the client notes, but something felt off. The air had grown colder, and a strange sense of unease settled over me. I tried to push the feeling aside and continued typing on my laptop. The office was always chilly at night, especially with the AC running, but this was different. It felt as if the temperature had dropped suddenly, like an icy wind was sweeping through the room. I stood up and walked over to the thermostat near the entrance of the
office.
I checked the settings, but everything seemed normal. The thermostat was set to a comfortable 72 degrees. As I turned to walk back to my desk, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the glow of the emergency exit light. It was too dark to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. Someone was standing there, watching me. I froze, my heart racing. "Hello!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless. I took a hesitant step forward, squinting to see if it was one of the cleaning crew, but as I moved closer, the figure seemed to dissolve into the shadows. One moment it was there, the next it was gone. My mind was racing. Had I imagined it? Was it a trick of the light? I walked down the hallway to where I had seen the figure, but there was nothing there, just the empty corridor stretching into darkness. The offices were locked, and no one else should have been on the floor. Feeling unnerved, I returned to my desk, trying to shake off the encounter. I had work to do, and I couldn't afford to get distracted, but no matter how hard I tried to focus, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced up from my screen, I half expected to see that figure standing there again, lurking just out of sight. At 10 p.m., the cleaning crew arrived. I heard the familiar clatter of their carts and the soft hum of the vacuum cleaner. Relieved by their presence, I told myself I was being ridiculous. My mind was playing tricks on me, that's all. It was late, and I was exhausted, But then something strange happened. As the janitors worked their way through the office, they never once came near my desk. Normally, they would empty the trash bins, dust the shelves, and vacuum the carpet, but that night they seemed to be avoiding my area altogether. I watched as they moved from cubicle to cubicle, working diligently, but when they reached the row where my desk was, they stopped. I stood up and waved to get their attention, but the janitors didn't even glance in my direction. They simply turned and walked the other way, leaving my corner of the office untouched. I found it odd, but I figured maybe they had a schedule to follow or were planning to come back later. By midnight, I was the only one left in the office. The cleaning crew had finished their rounds and disappeared, leaving the floor in complete silence. I still had hours of work ahead of me, but I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over me since seeing that shadowy figure. As I sat there, typing away, I began to hear the sound again, those soft footsteps, pacing slowly down the hallway. This time, they were closer, more deliberate. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I turned around, expecting to see someone standing behind me, but the office was empty. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just the building settling or some other mundane explanation. But then the footsteps grew louder, more insistent. They weren't just random noises anymore. They were deliberate, moving directly toward my cubicle. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood up and grabbed my phone. I dialed security, but the line went straight to voicemail. Panic set in as the footsteps stopped right outside my cubicle. I could feel a presence there, just beyond the partition, waiting. I held my breath, not daring to move. For a few agonizing moments there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the footsteps resumed, this time moving away, disappearing down the hall. I sat back down, my hands shaking. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't focus on work anymore. My mind was racing with questions. Had I really seen something? Was I imagining things? Or was there something else in the office with me? I packed up my things, ready to leave, but as I stood up, I heard it again, this time a faint whispering. It was so soft I almost didn't notice it at first. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, filling the empty office with a strange, unnatural energy. I walked toward the elevator, but as I approached, the whispering grew louder. It was unintelligible, like multiple voices speaking at once, overlapping in a chaotic murmur. I pressed the button for the elevator, but nothing happened. The doors remained closed, and the whispering continued, growing louder with each passing second. Desperate, I turned and headed for the stairwell. I pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, but the moment I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The stairwell was pitch black, the lights flickering on and off sporadically. I raced down the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more frantic with each step. I could feel something chasing me, something unseen but undeniably present. I didn't stop until I reached the lobby, gasping for breath as I burst through the exit. The security guard at the front desk gave me a strange look as I stumbled into the lobby, disheveled and out of breath. "You all right?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. I didn't know how to answer. I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to explain what had just happened. How could I? It sounded insane. I never worked late at the office again after that night. I made sure to leave before sunset, no matter how much work I had. And every time I walked past that darkened hallway, I couldn't help but glance over, my shoulder half, expecting to see that shadowy figure standing there watching. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in that office. Was it a ghost, a hallucination, or something else entirely? All I know is that whatever it wasn't friendly. It was something dark, something malevolent, and I have no desire to ever find out what it wanted, Hospitals have always made me uncomfortable. The sterile smell of disinfectant mixed with the quiet hum of machines and the hushed whispers of nurses moving from room to room sends a chill down my spine every time. My job as a night shift nurse only intensified that feeling. The long, silent corridors and the low lighting made the hospital feel more like a place where souls lingered rather than a place where people were healed. I started working at St. Augustine's General Hospital 3 years ago. It's an old building with creaky floors, thick stone walls, and long, winding hallways. Most of the time it was just a normal job, routine patient checks, administering medications, and tending to emergencies. But there was one part of the hospital that everyone avoided during the night shift: the third floor. The third floor housed the long-term patients, people who were too sick to go home but not in critical condition. But there was something
about that floor that unsettled everyone. The air was always heavier there, colder, and you couldn't help but feel like you were being watched.
The worst part, though, was room 312. Room 312 had been vacant for as long as I had worked at the hospital. No patient had been assigned to that room, and yet strange things kept happening. Lights flickered in the hallway outside the door. Nurses swore they heard faint voices, and occasionally someone would claim they saw movement inside the room through the small window on the door. The official explanation was that it was just faulty wiring or a draft in the old building, but we all knew better. The stories about room 312 had been passed down from shift to shift. Nurses who had been working there longer than I had would tell tales of an unseen patient who supposedly died in that room years ago under mysterious circumstances. No one knew the full story, and the hospital administration denied any such event, but the rumors persisted, and it was enough to keep most of the night staff far away from that part of the floor. One particularly quiet night, I found myself assigned to the third floor. We were short, staffed, and I had no choice but to take the shift. It was just after midnight when I started my rounds, moving from room to room, checking on the patients. Everything was going smoothly until I reached room 310. That was when I heard it, the faintest sound like a low whisper coming from the direction of room 312. I stopped in my tracks, my heart beating faster. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just a draft or the wind outside. But as I continued my rounds, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It was as if someone was having a conversation behind the closed door of room 312. I knew I should have just ignored it, kept moving. But curiosity got the better of me. I walked slowly toward the door of room 312, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. I could feel the cold air seeping through the cracks in the door, and as I reached for the handle, I hesitated. I wasn't supposed to go in there. That room was off limits for a reason. But something was compelling me to open the door, to see for myself what was inside. I took a deep breath and turned the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside filtering through the blinds. It looked like any other hospital room, an empty bed, a nightstand, and a chair by the window. But there was something wrong. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and it was much colder than the rest of the floor. I stood there for a moment, listening. The whispering had stopped. The room was completely silent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I took a few steps toward the bed, and that was when I noticed it. The bed was unmade. That wasn't possible. Room 312 had been vacant for years. No one had been assigned to that room, and yet the bed looked like someone had been lying in it recently. The sheets were rumpled, and there was an indentation on the pillow, as if someone's head had been resting there. A cold chill ran down my spine. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. As I reached the door, I heard it again, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the window. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkened room, but there was no one there. The chair by the window was empty. I was about to leave when something caught my eye. The reflection in the window, it wasn't mine. Standing behind me, just out of reach, was the faint outline of a figure. I froze, unable to move, my breath catching in my throat. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence. It was watching me, waiting. Without thinking, I bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. I stood in the hallway, my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. My hands were shaking, and my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen. Who would believe me? It would sound like I had lost my mind, but from that night on, I avoided the third floor whenever I could. I made excuses, traded shifts, did whatever I had to do to stay away from room 312. But the hospital had other plans for me. A few weeks later, I was assigned to the third floor again. This time, I made sure to stay far away from room 312. But as the night wore on, the familiar feeling of being watched returned. I tried to ignore it, focusing on my rounds, but the whispers followed me, growing louder and more persistent with each passing hour. Around 3 a.m. I was checking on a patient in room 311 when I heard it, the sound of a door opening behind me. I turned, expecting to see one of the other nurses, but the hallway was empty. And then I saw it. The door to room 312 was wide open. My heart stopped. I had closed that door, I was sure of it. I had checked it at the beginning of my shift, making sure it was locked, just like I always did. But now it stood open, the darkness inside beckoning me. I stepped into the hallway, my eyes fixed on the open door. I wanted to run to get as far away from that room as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. Something was drawing me in, pulling me toward the open door. As I approached, the whispering grew louder, more frantic. It was coming from inside the room, just like before. I reached the doorway and peered inside, half expecting to see the same empty room I had seen weeks earlier. But this time it was different. The bed was occupied. A man lay on the bed, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes staring up at the ceiling. He didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. He just lay there, breathing shallowly, as if he were on the verge of death. I stood there, frozen in place, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. No one was supposed to be in that room. There were no patients assigned to room 312. And yet, here he was, as real as the floor beneath my feet. I stepped into the room, my heart pounding in my chest. "Sir," I called out, my voice barely a whisper. "Are you all right?" The man didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, his chest rising and falling with labored breaths. I approached the bed, slowly, my hand trembling as I reached for his wrist to check for a pulse. The moment I touched him, a wave of cold washed over me. His skin was ice, cold, like touching a corpse. But he wasn't dead, not yet. His chest continued to rise and fall, his breaths shallow and weak. I looked around the room, searching for any sign of what might be happening. But there was nothing, just the man, the bed, and the cold, suffocating air that filled the room. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The man's breathing grew more labored, and his chest heaved as if he were struggling for air. His eyes, once fixed on the ceiling, slowly turned to meet mine. A chill ran down my spine as his gaze locked onto me. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He was trying to speak, but the words wouldn't come. I leaned closer, straining to hear him. "What is it? What are you trying to say?" I whispered. For a moment, there was only silence. And then, in a voice barely audible, he whispered a single word. "Help!" I recoiled, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I was a nurse. I was trained to help people, but this was something
else entirely.
I had no idea how to help him, no idea what was happening. Before I could react, the man's body convulsed, his chest rising off the bed as if he were being lifted by an invisible force. His eyes rolled back into his head, and a guttural scream
escaped his lips. I stumbled back, my hand covering my mouth as I watched in horror.
The man's body writhed on the bed, his limbs contorting in unnatural angles as the scream grew louder, filling the room with an ear-piercing wail. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room fell silent, the air still and heavy. The man lay motionless on the bed, his eyes closed, his chest no longer rising and falling. He was dead. I backed out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing.
What had just happened? Was it real? Or had I imagined the whole thing? I didn't have time to process it. I turned and ran down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. I needed to get away from that room, away from whatever I had just witnessed.
But as I reached the end of the hall, I stopped. I had to know. I had to be sure. I turned back and looked at the door to room 312. It was closed. There was no sign of the man, no sign of what had just happened. I never went back to the third
floor after that night. I made sure of it. Whatever was in room 312, whatever had happened to that man, I didn't want to know.
Hospitals have always been places where life and death coexist in a strange, tenuous balance. Every shift I see patients come and go, some recovering, others slipping away. The hospital is a place where hope and fear constantly collide. But there's one story from my years as a nurse that has stayed with me, an experience that still gives me nightmares and makes my skin crawl. I had been working at St. Vincent's Hospital for about 5 years, mostly covering the night shift. It was a quiet hospital on the outskirts of town, a large, imposing structure built in the 1960s. Some parts of it had been updated with modern equipment, but other parts, especially the old East Wing, still felt like a relic of a different time. The fluorescent lights flickered, the walls seemed to hum with a low vibration, and the air always felt a little too cold. The East Wing was where patients who needed long-term care were placed. Most of them were elderly or terminally ill, and it wasn't uncommon for the nurses to find themselves dealing with more deaths than recoveries on that floor. It wasn't a place many of us liked to work, especially on the night shift. The dim lighting and the long, echoing corridors made it feel like something out of a horror movie. But that was my job. I remember that night vividly. It was a cold, windy evening in late October. The wind howled against the windows, making the entire building creak. There were only a few of us working the night shift that evening, and as usual, I was assigned to the East Wing. The night started off as any other: routine checks, administering medication, and filling out paperwork. But as the hours ticked by, the atmosphere on the floor began to change. It started around midnight. I was sitting at the nurse's station, going through some charts, when I heard a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from down the hall. At first, I thought it was just one of the patients moving around in their room, but when I glanced at the monitors, none of the patients were awake. The tapping continued, growing louder and more persistent. It sounded like someone tapping their fingers on a hard surface over and over again. I stood up, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The hall was dimly lit with only a few lights casting long shadows on the floor. The tapping seemed to be coming from room 407 at the far end of the hallway. Room 407 had been empty for months. It was one of the older rooms that we rarely used anymore, mostly because the heating didn't work properly, and it was always freezing in there. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed my flashlight and started walking toward the room. The tapping continued, steady and unrelenting, echoing through the hallway as I approached. When I reached the door to room 407, I stopped. The door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness inside. I pushed the door open slowly, the old hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The room was empty, just as I expected. The bed was made and the equipment was all turned off. But the tapping, it hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more insistent, as if it were right next to me. I shined my flashlight around the room, but there was nothing there. No patient, no equipment malfunctioning, nothing. Just the empty bed and the cold air that seemed to seep from the walls. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was almost suffocating. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was pounding and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I knew I should leave, but something kept me rooted in place, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. That's when I saw it. At the foot of the bed, there was a small, dark stain on the floor. It was barely noticeable in the dim light, but when I shined my flashlight on it, I realized it was a patch of dried blood. I knelt down, my stomach turning as I inspected the stain. It looked old, but I couldn't understand why no one had cleaned it up. We were meticulous about keeping the room spotless, especially in a hospital. I stood up, feeling a sudden chill in the air. The temperature in the room had dropped even more, and I could see my breath in the cold. I turned to leave, but before I could take a step, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. This time, it was right, behind me. I froze, my heart racing. Slowly, I turned around, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I aimed it toward the sound. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a figure, a woman. She was dressed in a hospital gown, her long, dark hair hanging over her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her arms hung limply at her sides. She stood there, motionless, staring at the floor. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were glued to the floor, and my voice was caught in my throat. All I could do was watch as the woman slowly lifted her head, her hair falling away from her face. Her eyes, they were empty. Black, hollow sockets stared back at me, and her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile. She opened her mouth, and a low, raspy voice whispered, "Help me!" I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this real? Was I hallucinating? The woman took a step forward, her bare feet making no sound on the cold floor. "Help me," she whispered again, her voice growing louder, more desperate. I didn't wait to hear what she said next. I turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I ran down the hallway, not stopping until I reached the nurse's station. My colleague, a fellow nurse named Rachel, looked up at me with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, her brow furrowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I could barely catch my breath as I tried to explain what had just happened. There's something in room 407, I stammered, my voice shaking. "A woman. She's in there." Rachel's expression softened, and she sighed. "Room 407, she said quietly.
"I thought you knew." "Knew what?" I asked, still trying to calm myself down. Rachel hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "A few years ago there was a patient in that room," she began. "An elderly woman. She had been in and out of the hospital for months, but one night she just vanished." "Vanished?" I repeated, my stomach twisting in knots. Rachel nodded. "She was there 1 minute and the next she was gone." The
Nurses searched the entire floor, but there was no sign of her. The security cameras didn't catch anything, and no one saw her leave. It was like she just disappeared. I felt a chill run down my spine. "And the tapping?" I asked. "The blood on the floor?" Rachel bit her lip. "Some of the
staff say they've heard tapping coming from that room ever since she vanished," she said.
And as for the blood, well, no one's really sure where it came from. Some say it's from another patient who died in that room years ago. Others think it's a sign that something darker is going on." I didn't know what to say. My mind was reeling from what I had just experienced. The woman in the room, the blood, the tapping, it all seemed too surreal, too horrifying to be real. But deep down, I knew it was. I had seen her with my own eyes, heard her voice, felt the cold presence in that room. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the floor made my heart race. I avoided room 407 like the plague, refusing to go near it for the rest of the night. The next day, I asked to be transferred to a different floor. I couldn't handle the East Wing anymore, not after what I had seen. Thankfully, my supervisor agreed, and I never had to work that shift again. But even now, years later, I still think about that night. I still hear the tapping in my dreams, still see the woman's face whenever I close my eyes. And I wonder, is she still there, waiting for someone to help her? Or was she never really there at all? The thought haunts me to this day. Even now, whenever I pass by St. Vincent's Hospital, I can't help but glance up at the windows of the East Wing, half expecting to see her standing there, watching, waiting. The night shift at Glenview General Hospital always had an eerie, oppressive atmosphere. As a nurse who'd been working there for close to a decade, I'd seen my share of strange things. Patients delirious with fever talking to invisible figures, lights flickering for no apparent reason, and strange, sudden drafts sweeping through the hallways. But nothing compared to what happened in Ward B9. That place had a reputation, even among the most skeptical of us. Ward B9 was tucked away, in the oldest part of the hospital. It had been converted into a storage space after it was deemed too outdated to house patients. Still, some of the old hospital beds and medical equipment remained, gathering dust in the dim light. The ward was far from the main wing, accessed only by a narrow, winding corridor that felt like it stretched for miles. Most of us avoided that part of the hospital, except when we had to retrieve old equipment. I had my first encounter with Ward B, 9 one summer night, when the hospital was especially busy. We were understaffed and running low on supplies, so my supervisor asked me to grab some extra IV stands from storage. The only place to find them was Ward B, 9. Reluctantly, I agreed. I didn't believe in ghosts or any of the supernatural rumors circulating among the staff, but I wasn't exactly eager to visit the ward either. Something about that place always felt wrong. As I walked down the narrow hallway toward the old ward, I could feel the temperature drop with every step. The air was thick with dust, and the dim lighting cast long, shifting shadows across the walls. My footsteps echoed off the cold tiles, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I knew the ward had been abandoned for years. When I reached the door to B9, I hesitated. It was a large, heavy door with a small window set into it, the glass cloudy and cracked. I pushed it open slowly, the old hinges creaking loudly in the silence. The air inside the ward was even colder than the hallway, and the faint smell of antiseptic still lingered, as if the room had never quite forgotten its purpose. I stepped inside, my eyes adjusting to the dim light. The room was vast, with rows of empty beds lined up neatly along the walls. The old equipment, much of it rusting and covered in dust, sat abandoned in the corners. The shadows in the room seemed to shift and move as I walked further in, casting strange shapes that made my heart race. I headed toward the far end of the ward where the old IV stands were stored. As I approached, I heard something, soft, barely audible at first, like a distant whisper. I stopped in my tracks, listening intently, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a single voice, but several, all murmuring together in a low, indecipherable chorus. I spun around, shining my flashlight in every direction. There was no one there, just the rows of empty beds and the cold, stale air. But the whispers continued, swirling around me, growing louder and more urgent. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin as I quickened my pace, grabbing the IV stands and making my way back toward the door. But as I reached the middle of the room, something stopped me in my tracks. One of the beds, an old, rusted metal frame near the back of the ward, was no longer empty. A figure lay on the bed covered by a thin white sheet. I froze, my heart nearly stopping in my chest. There was no way anyone could be in that bed. The ward had been abandoned for years. I slowly raised my flashlight, the beam shaking as I aimed it at the figure. The sheet rose and fell gently as if someone or something was breathing underneath. For a moment, I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Was this some kind of prank? Had one of the other nurses come in here without me noticing? But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The air in the room had changed, thick and heavy, pressing down on me like a weight. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me on all sides, but I couldn't make out the words. It was as if they were speaking in a language I had never heard before. I had to leave. Now. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure on the bed. But as I reached the door, something even more terrifying happened. The sheet began to move. At first, it was just a slight twitch, but then the entire sheet lifted as if the figure underneath was sitting up. My breath caught in my throat as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. The figure sat fully upright now, the sheet still draped.
over its form, and then, with an agonizing slowness, it turned to face me.
I couldn't see its face, only the outline of a head beneath the sheet, but I could feel its gaze, cold and piercing, boring into me from across the room. The whispers had become a deafening roar, filling my ears with a cacophony of voices that
I couldn't understand. And then, without warning, the sheet slid off the figure's head, revealing a face I will never forget. It wasn't human. The creature had pale, almost translucent skin, stretched tight over its skull.
its eyes were black, bottomless pits, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin that made my stomach churn. It stared at me for what felt like an eternity, that horrible grin growing wider, as if it was amused by my fear. I ran. I didn't. I just turned and bolted for the door, my legs carrying me as fast as they could. The whispers followed me, growing louder and more frantic with every step. I could feel the cold presence behind me, as if the creature was right on my heels, reaching for me with its bony, skeletal hands. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, and didn't stop running until I reached the nurse's station. My hands were shaking, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I collapsed into a chair, gasping for breath, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't. None of it made any sense. One of my fellow nurses, Emily, came over to check on me, her face full of concern. "Are you okay?" she asked, kneeling beside me. "You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't even sure what I had seen. I tried to explain, my voice shaking as I recounted what had happened in Ward B9. But as I spoke, I could see the skepticism in her eyes.
"I'm telling you, Emily," I said, my voice trembling. "There was something in there. Something wrong." Emily gave me a sympathetic smile and patted my arm. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," she said gently. "You
know how creepy that old ward is. We've all had weird experiences in there. But this wasn't just a weird experience.
I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had felt. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't focus on my work, my mind constantly drifting back to that awful figure in the bed. Every shadow in the hallway made my heart race, and every
whisper of wind sounded like the voices I had heard in the ward. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I couldn't get out of the hospital fast enough. I drove home in silence, my mind still racing, trying to make sense of what had happened. That night, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that horrible, grinning face, those black, soulless eyes staring back at me. I heard the whispers, the frantic, desperate voices that had surrounded me in the ward. The next day, I went to my supervisor and requested to never be assigned to Ward B9 again. I didn't give her the full reason, just said that I felt uncomfortable in that part of the hospital. She agreed, and from that day forward, I avoided the East Wing like the plague. But the memory of that night has never left me. Even now, years later, I still think about that figure in the bed, the whispers, the cold presence that had followed me out of the ward. I've tried to rationalize it, to convince myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something in Ward B9, something that doesn't belong in this world, and whatever it is, it's still there, waiting in the shadows.